Suspension systems for gravel bikes come in two basic flavors. Those that support both the bike and the rider, like a traditional suspension fork or similar, and those that support just the rider, like the specialized Future Shock, the Redshift shock stop stem. And within this class of suspension systems, there are those that rotate to provide compliance and those that translate. In this video, a close look at an example of the latter and a discussion on my preferences for gravel suspension and why. So this is the FreeQENCE suspension stem by the German company Vecnum, who sent this sample to the channel for review a couple of months ago. Now in mid-2023, it retails for 299 euros or roughly $330 US. So it's not cheap. Now it's machined from the extra strong 7075 aluminum alloy and features hollow titanium pivots and hardware. The 90mm version of the stem, which is what I have here, weighs in at 287 grams and it fits any standard steer tube and accepts any standard 31.8mm handlebar. The stem offers 20mm of downward compliance, but also 10mm of upward compliance to prevent top out, which is like bottom out, but at the top of the stroke. The idea is that the nominal riding position for this stem is similar to setting up a mountain bike suspension sag. The stiffness of the spring is adjustable on the fly via this Allen screw on the side of the stem, which I think is the first of its kind, and it works pretty well to dial in the feel. Now I know some of you are going to remind us in the comments that the Future Shock 2.0 version is adjustable on the fly as well, but actually the 2.0 has an adjustable damping knob with a fixed spring. So you get kind of a similar effect, but it's not the same as actually adjusting the stiffness of the spring. And then of course, most other systems offer some type of adjustment to the effective stiffness, but they can't be adjusted on the fly. So how does the Vecnum stem ride? Well, I have to say, of all the suspension solutions that I've tried so far, this Vecnum FreeQENCE stem is actually my favorite in terms of pure ride feel. Now, of course it's subjective, but I just always had a hard time getting used to the single pivot action on the Redshift stem. Now for me, on the Redshift, I always feel like I'm being rolled forward over the bars because the bars are actually rotating about the single pivot point. This stem also has another drawback that fewer videos seem to address, which is that the amount of suspension travel that you experience actually depends on where your hands are on the handlebars. Now, of course, you get the most travel when you're way out on the hoods because you're applying the largest effective torque about the pivot. However, the closer you get to the axis of rotation, the smaller the moment arm and the less the effective travel. Now, at the extreme, if you're riding far back in the drops, your line of action can even intersect the pivot point and you would get no travel at all. Now, the benefit of a translational system like the Future Shock or this Vecnum here is that no matter where your hands are on the handlebars, you get a consistent amount of suspension travel and it's pretty noticeable while riding, at least in my experience. Now, compared to the Future Shock, the Vecnum stem actually feels pretty similar. Now, you might be inclined to think that the Vecnum is smoother because it employs a linkage, but the Future Shock actually does a pretty good job with small bump sensitivity since it does use a coil spring. Now, the difference, of course, is that the Vecnum stem is compatible with any standard fork steerer, and the Future Shock is a very complex proprietary system only available on select specialized models. So are there any drawbacks of the Vecnum stem? Well, some might argue that the Vecnum stem just looks kind of funky. It's very boxy and geometric, and it is bulkier than a standard stem. Now, is it any more odd looking than, say, a telescoping suspension fork on a gravel bike, or something like the Lauf suspension fork? Well, I'll leave that up to you to decide. I do think if Vecnum could do anything to make the design a little bit more compact and traditional looking, it would make it all the more attractive to a typical consumer. Although I can see that it was already a huge engineering challenge to get this parallelogram linkage design down to this current form factor. So going any smaller and more compact may just not be possible. Although I will say that Redshift eventually did a standard and a pro version, so it's conceivable that Vecnum has something more premium in the works. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. So I think despite its quirky looks, I'd still have to give the nod for best overall suspension system to this Vecnum. Again, first and foremost because it translates rather than rotates. It's also much less proprietary than the Future Shock, which again, in my opinion, feels very similar to this Vecnum stem. The Vecnum stem is also lighter and cheaper than any suspension fork, and it fits any standard threadless fork setup. Now, I'm sure some of you will remind us that this stem basically already existed. back in the 90s, and it was called the SoftRide Stem. Now, depending on the model, the SoftRide weighed somewhere between 400 and 600 grams, and apparently it was recalled back in 1994 due to a small but non-zero chance of failure. Now, I never actually rode the SoftRide Stem, but the Vecnum here is clearly an updated iteration, and it adopts modern engineering and manufacturing practices. I don't know, maybe some of you who have ridden the SoftRide Stem can comment below on how that felt, but from what I heard, it had some quirks. Now, if all this talk about suspension for gravel bikes just makes you upset and you think it's entirely marketing fluff, I don't totally blame you. There's a lot of engineering and cost that goes into all of these suspension systems associated with making the front of your bike just a little bit squishier. And of course, there's an argument for scrapping novelty suspension systems entirely and just relying on solid frame design and proper pressure in large volume tires. The Richie Outback over here, for instance, employs a straight 1 1/8 steer tube for some compliance, and I've been running it with super supple 700C by 48mm tires set up tubeless, and I run them at roughly 25 PSI, and it really is pretty comfortable. Now, of course, the feel of the Richie isn't quite the same as an actual suspension stem like the Vecnum, which I do have to argue is legitimately more plush than supple tires alone, but large volume tires do come relatively close and they don't rely on anything extra. So lots to think about when it comes to comfort on your gravel bike. And of course, the other thing we haven't even mentioned is whether your local terrain or your riding style even warrant suspension at all. For those of you who tend to ramble on maintained fire roads, gravel suspension is probably unnecessary, to be completely honest. But if you do find yourself on rockier terrain or some single track, or basically anywhere you would get criticized for not just riding an XC bike, then adding a bit of suspension to your gravel rig might actually make more sense. All right, well, that's gonna wrap it up for this one. Definitely check out the Vecnum website for more information if you're curious. I'll put a link down in the description. Thanks again for watching, and thanks for subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.